very much for a wonderful welcome. Well, first of all, good afternoon to all of you. I think it's afternoon, isn't it? Not still the morning. And I'm going to start off by greeting you with the language of the chimpanzee. And it's a sound that's, for me, most wonderful in the African forest, a little bit like the howler monkeys of South America. So here we go. And in chimpanzee language that says, hello, this is me, Jane. So when I was a very tiny, tiny little girl, to go back to the beginning, I was born loving animals, all animals. And people say, what made you interested in animals? I don't know. I was born that way. And so I grew up with a dog. There was always a dog in our family. But I spent so much time outside watching the different birds and insects in our garden in England. And in those days, there was no television. It hadn't been invented. So for me, it was learning about animals by watching them or learning about animals in books. And so I spent hours and hours with my dog, sitting out, watching birds making their nests, watching squirrels burying their nuts for the winter. And the climate was very different back then. In England, we had cold, cold winters where we were in the south. We had lots of snow. Of course, with climate change, we don't anymore. But when I couldn't be outside watching animals because it was too cold or it was raining, then I was sitting inside reading books. Books was something else that I loved. And I had an amazing mother, and I think very early on she realized, well, if I find books for Jane about animals, she'll learn to read more quickly. And indeed, I'm sure that was true. So as I got older, I began spending Saturday afternoons in a little second-hand bookshop that I had discovered. We didn't get new books. This was when World War II was raging. And I don't think they made children's books. So my books either came from the library or else I burrowed around in this little second-hand bookshop and managed to get some very, very wonderful books, very, very cheap. I saved up my little bits of pocket money. And on this very special day when I was 10 years old, I found this little book. It was a very cheap edition, and I just could afford it. And it was called Tarzan of the Apes. So I took it home, I climbed my favorite tree, and I read it from cover to cover. And I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. I was very, very jealous. But of course, I knew perfectly well that there wasn't a Tarzan. But that's what made my dream. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. Everybody laughed at me. How will you do that? You don't have money. Africa's far away. Nobody knows much about it. It's a dark continent. And anyway, you're just a girl. But not my mother. She said, Jane, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity, and if you don't give up, hopefully you find a way. So when I left school, aged 18, I did really well in all my exams. My friends all went to college or university, but we couldn't afford it. I had to get a job, boring old secretarial. And then came a letter from a school friend, and she had moved out to Kenya with her parents, and she was inviting me for a holiday. Yes, out to Africa at last, the opportunity. So I was working in London. You couldn't save money in London. So I went home and I worked as a waitress in a hotel around the corner. Jolly hard work. And eventually, I think it was 5 or 6 months, I finally had enough to go to Africa by boat, because in those days, aeroplanes were not very many and extremely expensive. So I went by boat. And it took nearly a month. We had to sail all the way from London around Cape Town and up to Mombasa in Africa, because the Suez Canal was closed because of a silly little war between Britain and Egypt. So the first place I set foot on African soil was Cape Town. And it's very, very beautiful. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's got that iconic Table Mountain. And there were Africans dressed in their national costume. And I was really excited. But then we stopped there for 2 days. And my mother had friends there who'd said, "Don't worry, we'll look after Jane while the ship is in dock." And they took me around, and I began seeing on the back of the seats in the gardens and the parks, on the doors into the hotels and the restaurants, words in Afrikaans, "Slegsbank." And I said, "What do these words mean?" And they said, "White people only." And I wasn't brought up that way. My grandfather was a congregational minister. We didn't judge people by the color of their skin. So I couldn't wait to leave Cape Town. And finally got to Mombasa in Kenya. Kenya was on the brink of independence from British colonial rule, so it was a much better atmosphere. Stayed with my friend, and then somebody said to me, "Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis Leakey." He was a paleontologist, that's somebody who studies fossils, but he was also the curator of the Natural History Museum. And I went to see him, and he took me around. He asked me all sorts of questions about the animals in the museum. I don't like museums with stuffed animals, but nevertheless, I could answer most of his questions. And is this not amazing? Just 2 weeks before I arrived to meet Leakey, his longtime secretary had left, and I told you about that boring secretarial training I had, and so there I was. Now I'm in a world surrounded by people who can answer all my questions about the animals and the birds, the mammals, the insects, the plants of East Africa. And it was a magical time. And what it led to was something beyond my wildest dreams. He began talking to me about a group of chimpanzees living on a lakeshore. And he began saying that he really was hoping to find somebody who would go and study them, because nobody had studied chimpanzees. Well, I never dreamt that he was thinking of me. And so one day he said, "Well, why do you think I'm talking to you about these chimpanzees? Are you prepared to go and try and study them?" Wow. So yes, I am. It took him a year to get the money. And then the British authorities, because Tanzania was Tanganyika back then, still under British colonial rule, although not for long, and they refused this young girl on her own in the forest. That's ridiculous. We never heard of such a thing. But in the end, they said, "All right, but she can't come alone." So who volunteered to come? That same amazing mother. We had money for 6 months. Mum had to go back after 4. But by that time, the authorities thought, well, Jane's a bit crazy, but I suppose it's okay. So the awful part was, for the first 4 months, the chimpanzees took one look at me and disappeared into the forest. They were not exactly afraid, but I was something new and they did not like it. Chimpanzees don't like new things. Anyway, I was getting more and more depressed. Every morning I was up at crack of dawn. I was out there all day, and when I did see chimps, they would disappear. But then my mother had an enormously important role, because I would get back at dusk, unhappy and sad, and she said, "Jane, you're learning more than you think. You found this peak, and sitting up on that peak with your binoculars, you're learning something about the chimps every day. You see them making nests in the trees at night, bending the branches over. You see them feeding on the different foods which you're collecting. You see, sometimes they're wandering about alone, sometimes it's a little group of females and young, sometimes a group of males hanging out. You're learning more than you think. So it was very sad when she left, and it was just 2 weeks after she left that the breakthrough observation came, just before the money ran out. One chimpanzee had begun to lose his fear of me before the others, and he had a beautiful white beard, and his name is now known all around the world. David Greybeard, I called him. And on this never-to-be-forgotten day, he was sitting on a termite mound, and he was breaking off grass stems, pushing them down into the termite mound, carefully pulling out the stem, and eating off the termites which were hanging on with their jaws. And I saw him pick leafy twigs, and before he could use them as tools, he had to strip carefully all the leaves. And so David Greybeard was using and making tools. Now today, that wouldn't be in the slightest exciting. There are many animals who use tools, and just a few that actually make them. But at that time, science thought humans and only humans use and make tools. And so it was a real breakthrough observation. And it led to so many good things happening. First of all, the National Geographic Society said, oh, we'll fund this young woman when her initial 6 months' money runs out. And they said, as the chimps get more used to her, we'll send a photographer and a filmmaker to record what she's observing. So wasn't I lucky? The first person to be able to learn about chimpanzees and their behavior. And chimpanzees are more like us than any other living creature. We only differ in the makeup of our DNA by just over 1%. That's how like chimpanzees we are. And so gradually, partly thanks to David Greybeard, the other chimpanzees began to lose their fear, and I could get closer. And eventually I was able to sit and watch them behaving, usually up in the trees around me, sometimes even on the ground. And I began to relax, and I began to realize I was in a magic world, a world that nobody else, no other white person anyway, had ever been, the world of the wild chimpanzees. And I began to learn the different individuals. You're all different. You know each other by name. Chimpanzees are all different too. And I got to recognize them. And it wasn't just David Greybeard, but his great friend Goliath. And I learned that Goliath was the top-ranking male. And I learned that the males have a hierarchy. And then there was old Flo, the dominant female. Females have their hierarchy too, although all the adult males are dominant over all the females. But old Flo, the dominant female, what an amazing old lady she was. She already had offspring. Fabian was a young adult male, and Figan was an adolescent. And then there was 6-year-old Fifi. And soon after she'd got used to me, she produced a little infant Flint. And I was able to watch all the stages Flint went through as he was growing up, just as though he was a human infant in my family. The chimps became like family. And they were such amazing days of discovery. And it was helped because I set up a banana feeding station. And that was when the photographer, filmmaker came, Hugo van Lauwig. He needed to get close-up, good footage of the different chimpanzees. And he couldn't really carry his big, heavy, old-fashioned camera through the forest. And it was really important to get good footage of the chimps so that the money would go on coming through from the National Geographic. So those, as I say, were the days when I was learning. I was learning how the chimpanzee family is so strong. Even an adult male will spend time with his old mother if she's still alive. And within the family members will support each other. And the female chimp doesn't have her first baby until she's about 13 or 14. And then, unlike humans, she doesn't produce so many babies to overpopulate her forest. She has one baby about every 5 years and suckles that child until the next baby is born. So I was learning all these things. I watched chimpanzees hunting for monkeys, not very often, but some of the males were really good hunters. Others just let the good ones do the work and sometimes stole the prey from them afterwards. They're just like people. They have their likes and dislikes and their squabbles. And so I was learning how like us they are, but I was shocked to find that just like us, they have a dark and brutal side, and they're capable of killing. And the males will patrol their territory, and if they see individuals from a neighboring community, they will give chase. If they catch that unfortunate individual, male or female, they attack them so severely that almost certainly that unfortunate victim will die of wounds received. And I was unhappy when I discovered this. I thought the chimps were like us but nicer. And then I found, no, they're just the same. But at the same time, just like us, they can show compassion, altruism. They're kind to each other. And if a mother dies and leaves a small infant, if that infant is under 3 years old, it will die because it needs the mother's milk. But 3 years and up, it's beginning to survive on solid foods. And so if a mother dies leaving a 3-year-old or 4-year-old or 5-year-old infant, it will be adopted by an older brother or sister. And if there isn't an older brother or sister, then an unrelated individual may take over, female or even an adult male, and save that infant's life. So there I was, having the most amazing days, learning all the time. And then came a big change in my life, because I got a letter from Leakey saying, Jane, I picked you because you hadn't been to university. I wanted someone whose mind wasn't cluttered up with what the scientists were teaching at that time. But now, he said, you must get a degree because I want other scientists to take you seriously. And we don't have time for you to do an undergraduate degree. I've got a place for you at Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology meant. It's behavior. So I was really, really nervous. And can you imagine what I felt when I got to Cambridge and these learned professors told me I'd done everything wrong. Jane, you shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. That's not scientific. You should give them numbers. You can't talk about them having personality. You can't talk about them having minds capable of solving problems. You can't talk about them having emotions like happiness, sadness, fear. Those are unique to humans. That's what science was teaching at the time, that we humans are the only sentient beings on the planet. Well, I've never been one to confront opposition. I just carry on doing what I know is right. And I'd been taught as a child by my dog that we're not the only beings with personalities, minds, and emotions. And any of you have had a dog, cat, or other animal, you know the same. Your animal has a personality, they have emotions, they can feel happy or sad, and a lot of them can solve problems. So anyway, I got my PhD in spite of everything, and I went back for the happiest days of my life. In Gombe, I had the degree. I built up a little research station, just a few students, and best of all, I could spend hours out in the forest, alone, sometimes with the chimpanzees, sometimes by myself. And I got this strong spiritual connection with the forest. And it was, the best, as I say, the best days of my life. And I was learning not only about the chimpanzees, but the other wildlife of the forest. So why did I leave? I left because I helped to put together a conference, and we brought together the people who by then were studying chimps in 6 other African countries. And we brought them together to learn, does chimpanzee behavior differ from one place to another place to another place? Do they have something like culture, which I thought they did and which we now know they do have? But we also had in that conference a session on the environment in these different countries. And it was shocking that everywhere chimps were being studied, the forests were being cut down, and chimpanzees were being hunted for bushmeat or to sell overseas for pets in circuses, and in those days, medical research. And so I went to that conference as a scientist. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in Gombe, but I left as an activist. I knew I had to do something to help, but I didn't know what to do. So got together some money, went to visit the 6 different field study sites, which by then existed, learned a lot about the problems faced by the chimps, but at the same time, I was learning about the problems faced by the people living there, that in so many cases, these people were desperately poor, and they had overused the land. They were moving further into the forest. And in some cases, like when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, it was particularly shocking because when I arrived in 1960, Gombe Forest was part of a belt of forest that stretched right across to the west coast of Africa. By the late 1980s, I looked down from a small plane and I was shocked to see a little island that was Gombe, a forest, and it was surrounded by bare hills. There were more people living there than the land could support. They were too poor to buy food from somewhere else, and they were cutting down the trees to make money from charcoal or timber, or to make more land to grow more food because their own farmland was infertile, overused. So it just hit me. If we can't help these people to find ways of making a living without destroying the forest, we can't save chimpanzees or forests or anything else. And so that began a program. I won't go into it, but it started off Take Care, we call it Takari, and it's helping the people in Gombe to find other ways of making a living. And it's scholarships to give girls a chance of secondary education. And it's microcredit where people can take out a tiny loan from a local bank for a small, environmentally sustainable program, like having a few chickens and selling the eggs, or getting some saplings and selling them to reforest the land. And that has been incredibly successful. And gradually, as we began to help the people in more different ways to find ways that they could live better, they came to trust us. We didn't swoop in as a bunch of arrogant white people telling them what to do. No, we sat down and listened. A little group of local people went into the 12 villages around Gombe and asked, what can we do to help? That's how it began. And so the people came to understand that the forest was important for them because it helped to regulate the climate and the rainfall, and because it kept the land fertile and kept the rivers flowing, the little streams. And so successful has that program been that it's now in 6 other African countries where chimpanzees live everywhere. It's helping people move out of poverty in a responsible way to look after the environment. And that's helping the chimpanzees and all the other animals who live there. So by this time, we're now into the late 1980s, I'm beginning to travel around the world to talk about the problems faced by the people in Africa, but also to try and raise money. And I'm discovering that all around the world, wherever I go, that we're destroying the planet. I was learning about, the ways that we are destroying the environment to build cities, the way that we're growing more food in an industrial way, destroying the land, how we're using the pesticides and herbicides that are poisoning the air, the water, and the earth. And I was learning about the people who have so much money and so much wealth, and yet they still want more, and they still want more. And then all the people living in poverty, destroying the environment in their desperation to survive. And I was meeting young people your age, older, university students as well, and I was finding everywhere that young people seemed to be losing hope. And I found that they were either angry, or they were depressed, or they just didn't seem to care. So I began asking them, why do you feel this way? And basically everywhere they said more or less the same, because you adults are destroying the planet, and there's nothing we can do about it. So the future of humans is doomed. Well, maybe some of you feel that way, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if you do. But that's when I began our program for young people that was mentioned, Roots and Shoots. And it began in 1991 in Tanzania. It began with 12 high school students. They came to see me at my house, and they were worried about different things. Some worried about the poaching going on in the national parks, the elephants and rhinos being killed for their ivory or their horn, or for meat. Some of them were worried about the treatment of stray dogs in the city. Some of them were worried about the street children with no homes. They all had their different worries, these 12 students, and they wanted me to solve them. And I said, look, go and get your friends and we'll have a meeting. So we had about 30 young people, and we discussed what could be done, and that's when Roots and Shoots was born. And we decided the most important message of Roots and Shoots was every single individual, now I'm talking about every one of you in this room, every single one of you, you make an impact on the planet every single day. And you're in a lucky position. You can choose what sort of impact you make, what you eat, what you buy, what you wear. And so that was the main message of Roots and Shoots. But we also decided, because everything is interrelated on this planet, that each group of Roots and Shoots would choose 3 projects. One would be to help people, one would be to help animals, and one would be to help the environment. Or you could just blend them all together because they are all interrelated and do one big project that helped people, animals, and the environment. So this program that began with 12 high school students in Tanzania in 1991 is now in 70 countries, and I think Brazil is the 70th country. It's approximately that anyway. And we have members in kindergarten, like I hope where I was just speaking to the young students here today, that they will form Roots and Shoots, maybe not all of them, but some of them. We have members in university and everything in between. And more adults are forming Roots and Shoots groups, and it's changing the world. So anyway, there we are now with chimpanzees being protected by the Jane Goodall Institute in 7 African countries. We have Roots and Shoots in 70 countries with young people of all ages. And today, as I travel the world, I find more and more people who are losing hope and becoming very depressed, and suicide rates are going up. And so the most important thing, and the reason I'm still traveling around the world, aged nearly 90, is because if we lose hope, we've had it. If we lose hope, we become apathetic and do nothing. So I've got 4 reasons for hope. And the first one is our amazing brain. It's the biggest difference between us and chimpanzees is the fact that our brain has enabled us to reach Mars. A little robot is crawling around on Mars taking photographs. So we're using our brain for all kinds of amazing technology. But unfortunately, we're not always using it for good. Making nuclear weapons, destroying the land with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. This is the bad use of our brain. More and more people are beginning to get together and find ways of solving some of the problems we've created, and getting together as individuals to show what we can do as individuals in our own little lives to make the world a better place. So my second reason for hope is the resilience of nature. You can completely destroy a part of nature. Give it time and some help, and possibly it will come back. Well, almost certainly. So I described the bare hills around Gombe. They're not there anymore. The trees have come back, and the climate is changing for the better. Animals on the brink of extinction can be given another chance. And then my third reason for hope, and my greatest reason for hope, is you young people. Once you decide that you're going to stand up on behalf of Mother Nature, on behalf of your fellow humans, on behalf of the animals, you are changing the world. Even as I speak, there are young people like you in all these 70 countries working, and Roots and Shoots is about working, rolling up your sleeves and taking action. And then my last reason for hope is the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up. And that's why I have Mr. H. Mr. H was given to me by a man called Gary Horn, which is why he's Mr. H. And Gary Horn went blind at 21 in the US Marines. And he decided for some peculiar reason to become a magician. Everyone said, but Gary, you can't be a good magician if you're blind. He lays his props out ahead, and if he was standing here, you wouldn't notice he was blind. So not only that, but he does skydiving and cross-country skiing. And he gave me Mr. H 32 years ago for my birthday, thinking he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee, and I took his hand and I made him hold the tail. I said, Gary, chimps don't have tails. So he said, never mind, take him where you go, and you know my spirit's been with you. So he's been with me to 62 countries. He's here today, the same old one, and he greets you, and his message to you is, never give up. There's always a way forward. And as Gary says to the audiences for whom he performs, he says, you know, you don't understand that if something goes wrong, and it may do, don't give up. There's always a way forward. And so Mr. H is somebody very special.